What did you put in your blood?
Nothing. Why are you looking at me like that?
Because it recognized you.
Recognized me as what?
I don't know, but it wants you close.
You mean you want me close?
My body decided before I did.
Doctor, step away from the human, now!
I can't!
Then the ancient instinct has awakened.
The collection vial was 3/4 full when Sarah Keth made the sound. Commander Marcus Colser had been in the medical chair for less than 4 minutes. Standard xenobiology exchange, his blood for a Veil baseline reading, the kind of bureaucratic science that kept diplomatic programs running and generated footnotes nobody would ever read. He had donated blood for stranger reasons. The Veil medical team was efficient. The scientist assigned to the collection had found his vein on the first attempt without commenting on it. He had noticed her when she walked in. Research division, not medical staff, the rank symbols on her collar marking her as senior. Her name was Sarah Keth. She had the focused precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had long since stopped thinking about the individual steps. She had not looked at him any longer than the job required, until she reached for the vial. Her fingers closed around it, and the sound she made moved through the room the way a tuning fork moves through metal, not loud, not sharp. A single syllable, low and resonant, in a register Marcus had never heard from a Veil in 3 years working alongside them. Felt before it was heard. His earpiece searched for a translation and returned nothing. Just a small red indicator. No match in database. Her entire body went still. The specific stillness of something compressed to its absolute limit. The lead technician said her name with careful neutrality. 2 full seconds passed before she answered, in Veil, quick and flat. His earpiece caught fragments. Equipment response. Calibration issue. Not applicable. Apologies, she said, switching to Galactic Standard without looking at Marcus. Calibration error. Corrected. She sealed the vial and continued the exchange as though the 2 seconds had not happened. Marcus watched her without comment. He was good at that. 3 years of xenobiology liaison work had given him a precise understanding of when a Veil was performing composure and when they were feeling it. Sarah Keth was performing it, carefully, with the deliberate smoothness of someone who had been told all her life that what had just moved through her was not real, and who was finding out now, with considerable difficulty, that she had been wrong about that. She said goodbye in Veil rather than Galactic Standard. His earpiece flagged one phrase with a tag he had only ever seen on archaeological audio, archaic, no current usage, foundational period. The translation returned 2 options, recognized or found. Apparently the same word, in a register extinct for 2,000 years, spoken by a woman who should not have been able to produce it. He saved the audio and walked back to the xenobiology wing in the focused quiet of a man who has picked up a thread and is already calculating how hard to pull. The full translation took 90 minutes across 3 linguistic databases. The third one, a classified archive for ancient language variants, returned a partial match at 31% certainty. For material 10,000 years old, that was high. Veil Proto-Linguistic Archive. Fragment consistent with ceremonial register. Veil foundational period 8,000 to 12,000 years before present. Root morpheme Kethsal. The recognition of bloodkin across distance. Secondary meaning. Ceremonial register, the one I have been searching for. Usage status. Enix. Compiler note. The Kethsal construct appears in the Veil foundational texts in connection with the founder mythos. The founders were a pre-civilization species credited with seeding Veil biological and cultural development before their disappearance approximately 10,000 years ago. The ancient sense, Veil Kethnar, associated with recognition events, is described as an instinctive biological response to genetically proximate founder lineage individuals. The ancient sense is not recognized as a real physiological phenomenon in contemporary Veil science, and individuals who report experiencing it are typically referred to behavioral medicine. Marcus read that twice, then he checked his messages and found the security notification he had not been expecting. Shan Vet, a Veil historical researcher attached to the Cultural Exchange Division, had been found dead in his quarters that morning. Cardiac arrest. Non-suspicious. He had met Shanvet twice. Once at a reception, once outside the linguistics archive, where the man had been carrying a stack of physical documents taller than his own head. He had seemed completely healthy. The directory confirmed what Marcus already half suspected. Shanvet had been a specialist in ancient Vale language history. A man who studied the ancient language had died the night before Marcus's blood triggered an extinct phrase from that same language. He filed a query for Bay 7 lab access logs. The reply took 20 minutes. His blood sample had been checked out at 2:43 in the morning and returned at 3:15 under a temporary access code assigned to no named individual in the station directory. Someone had taken his blood while he slept. He found Sarah Keth's communication address and sent 2 words, "We need to talk." Her reply came in 11 minutes. 1 word in Vale. The database returned 2 options, agreed or inevitable. The word form was archaic. Marcus looked at those 2 options for a long time. Agreed, inevitable. Both felt accurate. He opened the core transmitter, the one that operated on a separate frequency from the station's main network. He wrote a message carefully. It took 20 minutes to get exactly right. He sent it and recorded the timestamp. Then he went back to the translation database and began reading everything it had on the Vale foundational period. He read for 6 hours. By the time he stopped, the station lights had shifted to their night cycle, and he had enough of a picture to understand what he had walked into. Not the whole picture, but enough to know that the dead researcher and the stolen blood and the extinct phrase were all the same event viewed from different angles, and that whoever had moved first the previous night had moved because they believed this particular morning was the one they had been preparing to stop for a very long time. He sent Sarah Keth a second message. 6 words, "I found the star map. Tonight." Her reply came in 4 minutes. Agreed or inevitable. The same archaic word, the same binary. Archon Veldaru's emergency announcement came at 7:13 the next morning. Full biohazard containment. All Vale personnel to their habitat areas. All human personnel to human zones. All shared spaces closed until further notice. The announcement came through the Archon's office rather than through the station's Joint Medical Committee, which was the body authorized under the charter to issue containment protocols. It arrived 6 hours after Marcus messaged Sarah Keth and 4 hours after she replied. Marcus spent the morning doing exactly what was expected, filing a formal query with the liaison office, sending a careful update to his supervisor. At 10:30, Joint Security suspended his lab access pending review. He thanked them, closed the message, and began thinking about the station's architectural layout, which he had memorized in his second week because memorizing architectural layouts was simply what Marcus Cole did when he arrived somewhere new and expected things to get complicated. The connector corridors between designated zones were infrastructure access, not corridor, and the contamination protocol applied to designated areas only. A careful reader would notice that gap. 20 minutes in the connector corridors brought him to Shanvet's sealed secondary workspace. He queried the access log without opening the seal. 3 entries. Shanvet himself at 4 in the afternoon before his death, the security officer at midnight placing the seal, and a temporary access code at 1:45 in the morning. The same code that had checked out his blood sample from Bay 7 90 minutes later. A data chip wedged under a document shelf had been missed by the security sweep. Back in his quarters, what survived on the chip was a fragment of a star map, annotated with coordinates the Astronomical Survey archive matched to the Tau Vedras star cluster, flagged with a reference to a speculative paper by human astrophysicist Renata Ewan. 20 years prior, Ewan had proposed the cluster as humanity's most probable solar origin point based on isotopic drift in ancient meteorite samples. The paper had been ignored. She had called it high speculation, low evidence, but the math is interesting. The coordinates on Shanvet's map matched Ewan's proposed human origin cluster exactly. At 2 in the afternoon, Archon Veldaru came to his door. The Archon was tall, silver blue, wearing full diplomatic dress. He declined the offered seat and stood in the center of the room with the settled calm of a man who has been managing difficult situations for a long time and has learned not to rush them. He offered 14 months forward on a major mineral extraction review in exchange for the events of the previous day being classified as a sealed private medical matter. 14 months was not a small number. That was the kind of offer made when the thing being buried was worth considerably more than 14 months of anything. "I would need to consult with my leadership," Marcus said. "Of course." A pause, shaped like a warning. "In the meantime, I ask that you refrain from inquiries outside your official portfolio." After the Archon left, Marcus stood still for a full minute. He had already sent the core transmitter message before Veldaru walked in. That message was in the Galactic Council relay system. But standing alone in his quarters, Marcus understood for the first time that sending the message might not have been enough. He spent the next 3 hours in the classified Vale Political Archive, searching for precedent, specifically for any previous cases where a Keth-Nar recognition event had been formally reported. He found 3. The first was from 612 years ago. A Vale researcher had reported activation while working with a non-member species. The report had been submitted to the Concordat Scientific Registry. Within 40 days, it had been reclassified as an internal medical matter under Vale health privacy protocols. The non-member species contact had been terminated on grounds of diplomatic restructuring. No formal acknowledgement of the recognition event was ever entered into the public record. The second was from 390 years ago. Different species, different researcher, same outcome. The report was reclassified. The contact was terminated. The third was from 203 years ago. A Vale scientist named Veth Kale had not only reported the activation, but had attempted to file final documentation with the Galactic Council directly. Her filing had been intercepted and classified under Concordat Internal Affairs jurisdiction before it reached a council session. Veth Kale had been removed from her position and referred to behavioral medicine within a month. The non-member species contact had been placed on indefinite diplomatic suspension. 3 cases, 3 suppression events, 600 years, all successful. Marcus sat with this information for a long time. The pattern was clear. It did not matter that Article 12 of the Interspecies Charter required disclosure. The Vale had a mechanism for reclassifying recognition events as internal health matters before they could reach the level of a formal charter proceeding. If Veldaru moved quickly, Marcus's transmitter message could be intercepted at the relay level and reclassified before any council session was ever scheduled. And Sarah Keth could be referred to behavioral medicine before the end of the week. He sent her a new message, 3 words only, because if anyone was monitoring his lines, he did not want to give them more than necessary. Tonight, bring everything. Her reply came back, in 2 minutes, 1 word, inevitable. Marcus reached the secondary biology lab through a maintenance passage the contamination protocol had technically forgotten to close. Sarah Keth was waiting with her personal device in both hands rather than the Vale stimulant tea she usually carried, which told him she had not slept. She looked like someone who had spent the night finding out things she needed to know before this conversation. The 3 suppression cases, she said, before he could speak. He stopped. You found them too. I was looking for something else and found them by accident. Her voice was even, and it cost her something to keep it that way. Veth Kalkul. The 3rd case, 203 years ago. I found her original scientific documentation, not the Concordat version, her own. She set the device on the workstation. She hid a copy in a notation format that would look like calibration data to anyone who did not know what they were reading. Her suppression was already in progress when she hid it. She knew she was likely to lose. A pause. She hid the backup anyway. In case someone came looking later, Marcus said. Yes, Sarah Keth said. I think she knew she was not going to be the last one, and she wanted to make sure the next one had something to find. They stood with that for a moment. Veldaru came to me this morning, she said. He told me that what I experienced was real, that he did not doubt it, and that the most protective thing I could do for myself and for you was to allow the event to be documented as an anomalous physiological response and placed in a sealed file. She met Marcus's eyes. He was genuinely trying to protect me. That is the part that made it most difficult to refuse. What did you say? I said I needed time to consider it. She held his gaze.
He believed me. He should not have. He can move for reclassification before a council session is scheduled, Marcus said. He has done it 3 times. It has worked 3 times.
Yes. She looked at him directly. So we need something the reclassification mechanism cannot reach. The Keth Sal witness right, Marcus said, filed with documentation from the Foundational Archive and attached to Veth Kale's original records. The witness right predates the Concordat. It sits in foundational law. The Concordat cannot reclassify a foundational law proceeding as an internal health matter without invalidating the legal basis of their own authority. They kept the ancient law intact because they needed it to maintain legitimacy. They hid the evidence instead. He paused. If we attach the archived documentation in Veth Kale's records to the testimony before the session is called, the suppression mechanism stops working. She looked at him.
You spent last night reading Foundational Law. 6 hours, he said.
The archive is in the station.
Shanvet found it.
That is why he is dead. She turned her personal device toward him and played a recording. His earpiece registered the archaic Vale phonology immediately, foundational period markers appearing one after another, like lights coming on in a building that had been dark a very long time. I have been experiencing cascades since the exchange. 63 documented entries. What I just played you is the 41st. I believe it is an excerpt from the Keth Sal Oath. The pledge the Bloodkin recognizer speaks to the recognized one. She met his eyes. I am going to read something to you. Tell me what it sounds like. She read from memory. The archaic forms came out of her with a fluency her training had never given her, his earpiece working to keep pace, translations flickering between ancient meanings and modern approximations. What came through was formal and solemn, the language of a covenant built to outlast civilization itself. When she stopped, Marcus opened his personal device.
Chromosome 6, he said. A region of the human genome that encodes for nothing we have ever identified. No known protein expression, no regulatory function.
30 years of study and no answer for what it does. He turned the screen toward her. If you map the phonetic values of what you just read onto the genetic notation we use for that region, the match is exact. Not close. Exact, in the same order using a correspondence system we did not develop. The foundational texts did. Sarah Keth looked at the screen. When she raised her eyes, her second focal plane had gone very still and very bright. They encoded the oath into the human genome, she said, before they left. So the recognized one could verify the recognition was genuine. She did not look away from him. A biological key and a biological lock, separated across 10,000 years and 2-star clusters. Which means the 3 suppression events were not the Concordat covering up a medical anomaly, Marcus said. They were the Concordat suppressing evidence of what the founders actually were, and what happened to them, and what humanity actually is. He held her gaze. That is why Veldaru is careful rather than aggressive. He is not protecting an embarrassment. He is protecting a truth that would restructure the governance of this entire region. The door opened. 3 Vale security officers came through first, Archon Veldaru behind them. He had moved faster than Marcus had expected. Dr. Keth, the Archon said, his voice carrying the precise tone of concern rather than command. Commander Cole, I had hoped to avoid this particular meeting. The lead officer stepped toward Marcus. Sarah Keth moved. What happened was not a fight. Marcus had seen fights. This was something older than fighting, something that predated the category entirely. It was protection operating at a level that did not consult its host before acting. The lead officer reached for Marcus and found Sarah Keth between them before the reach completed. Not moving to block. Simply there, the way a wall is there, and her hand found his forearm at an angle that had no name in modern Vale security training, because modern Vale's security assumed Vale were civilized beings who resolved disputes with language. What her hand knew was older than civilization. It found the exact nerve cluster beneath the officer's forearm, with the precision of something that had been finding that cluster since before the Concordat existed. The officer's arm went numb to the elbow. He stepped back with a sound that was not quite a word. The second officer moved to flank. She pivoted to face the threat before the motion had fully developed, reading intention in the air before it became action. Her feet took a position she had never trained for. Her body opened a stance she had never practiced. The geometry of the room changed without anyone seeing her change it. Now only 2 officers could approach at once, and both approaches converged exactly where she was standing. The third officer, the one with enough experience to recognize when something fundamental had shifted, did not move at all. Veldaru had not moved either. He was watching Sarah Keth with something that was not anger. The look of a man seeing a thing he had known was theoretically possible, and finding that theory had not prepared him for the reality of it. The warding reflex, he said very quietly. Full activation. He looked at the lead officer holding his numb arm against his chest. Stand down. All 3 of you. The officers went to the corridor. Sarah Keth held her position for 3 more seconds. Then something in her slowly released, like pressure leaving a sealed chamber, and she stepped back. She looked at her own hands with the particular expression of someone who has just used a tool they did not know they possessed. The ancient combat protocols, Veldaru said, with the tone of someone reciting something memorized long ago and returned to many times since. The Foundational Archive describes them as one of the primary reasons the governing faction found the founders threatening. The Keth Nar in full activation does not respond to social hierarchy or institutional authority. It responds to threat and to the individual it has recognized, and it does not negotiate with the host. He paused. I had always assumed that passage was theoretical. You knew about the 3 suppression cases, Marcus said. Veldaru did not deny it. He looked at Marcus with the level attention of a man who has just understood that the person across from him has done more research than expected. The Article 12 filing, the Archon said. You sent it 2 days ago. Yes, and I know you have a mechanism for reclassification before it reaches a council session. I know you have used it 3 times. I know it worked all 3 times. Marcus held his gaze. I also know that the Kethsal witness right, filed with documentation from the Foundational Archive and Vethkale's original records, cannot be reclassified as an internal health matter. The witness right predates the Concordat. It sits in foundational law. You cannot touch it without invalidating the legal basis of your own authority. You kept the ancient law intact for 800 years because you needed it. That is the same reason you cannot use it against us now. The room was very quiet. We are going to the archive, Marcus said. You are going to come with us, because the alternative is that you move for reclassification, and we file the witness right without the documentation, and you spend the next 6 months in a legal process that exposes everything you have been suppressing to exactly the kind of examination you have been trying to avoid for 8 centuries. He paused. Or you come with us, read the walls one more time, and we find the narrow path together. 1 legal category, 1 seat at the table, where decisions about humanity's future get made. Nothing that breaks the architecture you have spent your life maintaining. Veldaru stood completely still for a long moment. Show me, he said. The archive was 3 levels below the recycling systems. The room held a glow that had been running for longer than modern battery technology had any right to sustain. The walls were covered in archaic Veil script from floor to ceiling, covered the way you cover something important when you need it to be found eventually, by someone who knows what to look for. At the center stood a data console, built on a modular architecture. Marcus recognized from exactly one context. The foundational design templates that Earth's entire space engineering tradition had been built on, recovered in pieces over 2 centuries, from sites everyone had always described as original human innovation. They had not been original. Sci-Fi placed her palm against the nearest wall and read. The old language came out of her with the fluency of something that had been waiting its entire life for this moment. The exile, she said, it was not unanimous. The archive records the debates. There were Veil who argued the founders had done nothing wrong except become more powerful than the existing order could accommodate. The faction that prevailed describes its own reasoning in full. The founders had developed the ability to perceive biological intention in other species, to understand what a living creature needed before that creature could articulate it. They were becoming intermediaries between the Veil and every other civilization they encountered, and the existing political structure had no framework for a power that could not be controlled. They were exiled for being too useful, Marcus said. They were exiled for being a kind of power that no existing category could contain, she said. She moved to the densest section of writing. The gate, the coordinates, the memory wipe, all recorded here. The memory wipe is described as a compassionate choice. She stopped on that phrase. That is the language people use when they know what they are doing is not fully defensible. Her hand moved slowly across the wall. The plan, written into the original exile documents, was that the founders would arrive in the Tau Vidris region, build a new civilization without the memories that had made them threatening, and eventually the Keth Nar would bring them home. The recognition instinct was designed as a return mechanism. When the founders' descendants encountered Veil again, the activation would prove the lineage had survived, and they would be welcomed back. She lowered her hand. They exiled them with the full intention of bringing them home. And then the faction that authorized the exile fell from power, and the faction that replaced them had no investment in the return. And the return was delayed and delayed. And eventually the gate was dismantled and the archive was sealed, and the story became mythology, and the Kethnar became an embarrassment. Her voice stayed level, and the effort of keeping it that way showed only at the edges. We forgot, deliberately, and the founder's descendants spent 10,000 years in the Tau Vidris cluster building. Everything the encoded memory prepared them to build. They called themselves humans, and they had no idea. Veldaru stood with one hand against the wall near the entrance, touching the writing the way a man touches something he has come back to many times and never been able to leave entirely alone. Releasing this would fracture the Concordat, he said. 47 civilizations arguing about who owns humanity, who owes reparations, what the mythology authorizes, and who has the right to interpret it. Humanity would become the most contested territory in the galaxy overnight. Not from hatred, from the opposite of it. You are right about that, Marcus said. Then we agree. We agree on what the full truth would do, Marcus said. The Article 12 filing does not release this archive. It creates one legal category. Humans have a biological relationship with the veil that predates the current diplomatic framework and requires formal acknowledgement. One seat at the table where decisions about our future get made. He held the Archon's gaze, enough to change the geometry, not enough to break the architecture. Veldaru looked at the walls, at the writing that said, "We will come back and we will know you and wait for us." He stood with those words for a long time. He had read them before. He had come back to them when the weight of what he was suppressing required the kind of reminding that only the original source could provide. He nodded. Once.
The precise nod of a man who has found the exact corner
Of something he can live with and is committing to it. The council session is in 4 days, he said. Yes, Marcus said. He looked at Sarah Keth. You understand what the witness right will cost you. Veth Kale was removed from practice within a month. I know, Sarah Keth said. I read her file. And you are still going to do this? Yes, she said. I am afraid of what happened to her. I am going to do this anyway. Something shifted in Veldaru's face. Not softening exactly. More like the adjustment of a man who has been waiting to find out what kind of person he was actually dealing with, and now has his answer. He walked out of the archive room without another word. His footsteps receded until the only sound was the bioluminescent walls holding their light in the quiet of a space that had been dark for 800 years and was now, finally, open. Sarah Keth looked at Marcus. Vethkale hid documentation in calibration notation. She knew she was losing when she hid it. She paused. She was waiting for someone to come looking. She was waiting for us, Marcus said. Yes. Sarah Keth picked up her personal device. We should not make her wait any longer. Marcus was in the corridor outside the joint governance chamber 20 minutes before the session when Archspeaker Ventorith found him. She was not hostile. Hostile would have been easier to work with. She had the settled confidence of a person who has already run the numbers and knows the outcome. Commander Cole, she said, I wanted to speak with you before the session. I think it will be useful for both of us. I am listening, Marcus said. What you have attempted here is not without precedent, she said. Young species file status requests. The outcome of Article 12 filings at this stage of development is well established. The Concordat will acknowledge the filing, recommend a standard review process appropriate to your level of development, and the matter will proceed through proper channels. That process takes time. It is designed to take time. She paused with the grace of someone offering a genuine courtesy. I am not your adversary, Commander. I am telling you that the architecture of this outcome was in place before you walked in here. Today will not change it. Marcus let her finish. I appreciate the directness, Archspeaker, he said. Let me be equally direct. She nodded graciously. You have built your argument on humanity's age, he said. 200 years of spaceflight. I understand why. By every conventional measure, that is the correct starting point. But the request in front of this council today is not built on humanity's age. He held her gaze without looking away. It is built on humanity's starting point. And I think, when you hear what that starting point actually is, you will find that your architecture was designed for a different kind of building. She looked at him steadily. And what is humanity's starting point? That, Marcus said, is what this session is about. He walked into the chamber. She followed a half-second behind him, and he did not look back, but he heard the pause in her step. The half-second of a person reaching for a response and finding the shelf where it should have been entirely empty. The council moderator called the session to order at 900 exactly. 41 Vael faces in the surrounding tiers. 6 holographic relay presences from member civilizations attending remotely. Among the relays was the pale gold light of the Cheloth, the oldest spacefaring species in this region of the galaxy. In 300 years of council participation, they had never spoken on a matter involving a non-member species. They had never needed to. Veldaru rose first. He had stopped, concealing the weight of what he was carrying, and the chamber noticed it immediately.
The Vail Concordat acknowledges the Article 12 filing as legitimate and will provide formal response in this session.
A pause with the quality of a decision already fully made and fully committed to. Following internal consultation, the Concordat confirms the following. Biological recognition protocols of the type, referenced in Commander Cole's filing, exist within Vail hereditary biology. These protocols, the Keth-Nar, are documented in the Vail biological record as a feature of the foundational period of Vail development. The Concordat confirms that a full activation event consistent with Keth-Nar response occurred during the recent xenobiology exchange between Vail and human personnel directed toward a human individual. He sat. Ventorith rose immediately. She did not look at Marcus. The Archspeaker notes for the record her significant reservations about this proceeding. The Article 12 filing rests on the claim that a biological anomaly in one Vail scientist constitutes grounds for formal status determination regarding an entire non-member species. Her galactic standard was impeccable and cold. The humans are a young species, less than 200 years into spaceflight. With no standing in the Concordat framework and no demonstrated capacity for participation in interstellar governance at the level this filing implies. The Archspeaker recommends the Council decline to recognize Article 12 grounds and refer the question of human status to the standard multi-decade review process applicable to all emerging spacefaring civilizations. The moderator turned to Marcus. He had prepared remarks. He set them aside. I want to thank the Archon for a statement that required considerable deliberation to make. He looked at Ventorith across the chamber. And I want to thank the Archspeaker for being direct, because I think directness matters more than politeness when the thing being discussed is whether a species gets to be in the room while decisions about their future are made. He let that land. The Archspeaker is correct that humanity is young by galactic standards. We have been spacefaring for less than 200 years. We arrived in this region as newcomers, as the species that everyone else had already made plans around before we were invited to weigh in. What Article 12 asks for is simple, not full membership, not privileges we have not established. Just this, when the civilizations in this chamber discuss what comes next for this region of space, one of the voices in that conversation is ours. We are not asking to lead. We are asking to be present. He paused. 200 years ago, we did not have ships. We are now standing in a room at the edge of known space, asking to participate in the governance of it. The Archspeaker may call that insufficient grounds for recognition. We call it a beginning. He sat. Ventorith rose again. The moderator raised a hand. The council will now hear from Dr. Sarah Keth of the Vail Concordat Science Division, the moderator said, who has invoked the Keth-Sal witness right under ancient Vail law, accompanied by documentation submitted from the Foundational Archive and the original scientific records of Veth-Kael under Article 7 of the Foundational Charter. A murmur moved through the chamber at the last phrase. Not loud, but present. Ventorith, who had been rising, sat back down slowly. Foundational Charter. Article 7. That was not the same jurisdiction as a standard council's proceeding. That was a tier above it. And it had not been invoked in this chamber in living memory. Sarah Keth walked in through the chamber entrance in formal Vail ceremonial dress, deep indigo. She carried a data cylinder. She walked to the center floor and stood beside Marcus without looking at him. She faced the tears. I am Sarah Keth, she said, clearly. For the record, Senior Xenobiologist, Vail Concordat Science Division. On the date recorded in this session's preparatory documents, I experienced a full Keth-Nar recognition event while conducting a standard xenobiological exchange with Commander Marcus Cole of the Human Expeditionary Science Corps. She set the data cylinder on the presentation surface.
I am also submitting documentation from the Foundational Archive, including the original scientific records of Veth-Kael, a Vail biologist who attempted to bring this same evidence to this council
203 years ago. Her filing was intercepted. She was removed from practice. Her work was sealed. Sarah Keth looked at the chamber. She hid her original documentation in a notation format that would appear to be calibration data, so that if anyone came looking later, there would be something to find. A pause. Someone came looking. The chamber was very quiet. The arch-speaker has described my experience as one anomalous in one individual under uncontrolled conditions. I want to be precise about what it actually was. Because I am a scientist, and precision is what I can offer that other forms of testimony cannot. She spoke for 8 minutes. She described the vial, the moment her fingers closed around it, the way it moved through her, not as emotion but as the activation of something that had been waiting her entire life. This cascade events, 63 documented entries, the chromosome 6 correspondence, a key and a lock separated across 10,000 years, the warding reflex in the secondary biology lab, the 3 security officers, the specific nerve targeting her hand had executed without instruction from her conscious mind, the geometry of protection her body had assumed without ever training for it. She said, "The Kethnar does not operate on conscious permission. It does not ask whether activation is convenient or professionally appropriate. It activated because Commander Cole required protection, and it does not negotiate with the host." The arch-speaker calls this one data point. I am a scientist who has spent 4 days documenting this phenomenon. With the rigor my training demands, the documentation points in one direction. It has pointed in one direction since the moment I first held this man's blood in my hands. 63 entries later, it has not pointed anywhere else. She lifted the data cylinder. Veth Kale tried to tell this council the same thing 203 years ago. She was stopped before she could reach this chamber. She spent the rest of her career under supervised medical care. Her work was erased from the official record. Sarah Keth set the cylinder down on the presentation surface with a deliberate, quiet sound that carried across the chamber. It was not erased from everywhere. She stepped back. The chamber held a silence that had weight to it. The Chelith relay brightened. The Chelith representative inclined forward, and in 300 years of council participation, that gesture had never once been ignored. People who had been speaking stopped. People who had been rising sat back down. The chamber gave the Chelith the kind of attention that civilizations give to something very old that has decided after a very long time to speak. The council recognizes the Chelith, the moderator said. The Chelith voice came through the relay with the slow, layered quality of something that has been watching civilizations for longer than most of those civilizations have been watching themselves. The Chelith have been present in this region of space since before the Concordat existed in its current form, the representative said. In that time, we have observed 47 species achieve spaceflight. We have watched all of them learn what they are, their capabilities, their limitations, their place in the structure of living things. It is a process that takes time and patience and considerable difficulty. A pause, not theatrical. Genuinely present. This is the first occasion in our 300 years of council participation in which we have had the privilege of observing a species not learn what they are. The chamber held its breath. But remember, the Chelith said, what they have always been. In the second tier, Ventura sat down, not with the collapse of someone who has been defeated, with the careful, deliberate movement of a person whose map of the territory has just been redrawn beneath them, who is choosing, very precisely, how to stand on the new version of it. The Chelith votes in favor, the representative said. The vote took 30 minutes. 35 in favor, 5 against, 2 abstentions. Protected cognate status granted to humanity under the ancient Kethsal precedent, effective immediately. Foundational archive documentation and the records of Veth Kale entered into the permanent public record under Article 7 of the Foundational Charter. That last part had not been in Marcus's original filing. The moderator had added it after Sarah Keth submitted the data cylinder. The suppression mechanism, all 3 precedent cases, was now part of the public record. Veth Kale's work was no longer sealed. Whatever the Concordat had been using to stop this for 800 years had just been removed from the toolkit in full view of every council member in the chamber. The chamber dispersed with the slow deliberateness of a room in which something has changed permanently. Velderu found Marcus in the corridor. The archive documentation entered into the public record. the Archon said. That was not part of the arrangement we discussed. No, Marcus agreed. It was not. You planned it from the beginning. I planned it from the moment I found the 3 suppression cases, Marcus said. The legal category we discussed was the minimum. The documentation was insurance. If the Concordat tried to reclassify after today, they would have to explain why they were sealing something already entered into the public record under foundational law. He met the Archon's gaze. That is not a threat to you personally. That is the architecture holding. Velderu was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Marcus had not expected. I agreed to help because I understood that containing this was no longer possible after the warding reflex, he said. But I want you to understand something else. When I stood in the archive room and read those walls and looked at you, I thought that perhaps the people who wrote them deserved someone willing to honor their intention. He paused, even imperfectly, even 3 generations too late. Marcus held his gaze. Imperfectly is more than most things get, he said. Veldaru nodded once and walked away. Ventorith found Marcus a moment later. She approached with the bearing of a person who has examined a position and found it had been built on an incomplete foundation. I argued against recognition today because by every measure available to me, humanity was too young to have standing in this chamber, she said. Those measures were not wrong. They were incomplete. She held his gaze for a moment. I was not wrong about your age, Commander Cole. I was wrong about what age measures. She moved past him without waiting for a response. The statement needed none. It was its own completion. Sarah Keth was in the secondary biology lab when Marcus found her, sitting beside the viewport, watching the star field turn with the station's slow rotation. She looked up when he came in. The research appointment review notification arrived while you were in the corridor, she said. Marcus pulled a stool to her side of the viewport and sat. What does it say? That it is under review pending inquiry into the circumstances of today's testimony. She looked at the stars. Written in the language institutions use when the decision has already been made and the documentation is being completed. A pause. Veth Kale was removed within a month. You are not Veth Kale, Marcus said. Her testimony was sealed. Yours is in the public record under Article 7. Anyone who moves against you is doing it in full view of every member who voted today and in full view of the Cheloth statement, which is also now in the permanent record. He looked at her. You understood that when you submitted the data cylinder. She turned to look at him. Yes, she said. I understood it when you told me about Article 7. 3 nights ago. He held her gaze. You were ready to do it anyway, before you knew about Article 7. Yes, she said. I was. A pause. Veth Kale was ready too. She just did not have someone who had spent 6 hours in the classified archive finding the path that the suppression mechanism could not follow. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside the viewport, the star field continued its slow turn. The chromosome 6 sequence, Sarah Keth said, mapping the full genetic encoding across the entire human genome.
It would require a joint research framework, official access to human genetic archives, 5 years of work at minimum.
She looked at him directly. Do you want to help? Outside the viewport, 10 billion people on a planet in the Tau Vedris cluster were going about their lives, building everything the encoded memory had prepared them to build, not knowing yet what they were waiting to find out, not knowing that someone had come looking for what Veth Kale had hidden, not knowing that the waiting had ended on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning when one drop of blood touched the right hands at the right moment. Yes, Marcus said. Your supervisor, Sarah Keth said. What will happen to you? She will be furious with me for approximately 6 weeks, Marcus said. And then she will look at the outcome and be furious for 2 more weeks specifically because she cannot be angry about the outcome. And then it will be fine. Something shifted in Sarah Keth's second focal plane. The small adjustment he had learned over 4 days to read as the veil equivalent of amusement. It was the first time he had seen it since the exchange in Bay 7. And in the specific context of everything those 4 days had contained, it landed like the first light after a very long time in the dark. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. The word in the archive. The word the exile documents used for home. The place the founders were meant to return to. She looked at him. In the modern language, the closest equivalent is either home as a place of origin or home as a destination you have been traveling toward without knowing you were traveling. The archaic form does not distinguish between those meanings. It uses the same word for both. because the original writers did not see them as different things. Outside, the station's rotation carried the starfield past in its slow, reliable arc. Stars that had been there before any of this and would be there long after, in the arrangements that made the galaxy feel very large and the presence of any particular species in it very specific, and, perhaps, not entirely accidental. That is either very simple or very complicated, Marcus said. Yes, Sarah Keth said. That is exactly what I thought. They sat in the quiet of the room with the starfield moving outside, and the documentation of 10,000 years entered into a public record that could not be sealed again, and Veth Kale's work finally, where it was always meant to be. And for a while neither of them said anything else, because some things do not need more words than that. It had been starting for 10,000 years before. Either of them were born, moving at the pace of exile and forgetting, and the long silence between stars. And then the silence broke, and it had not been able to stop since.